Next Tuesday, our program is organizing a lecture by Volodymyr Kulik, who has not once but many times been to Harriman Institute and has taught here. And this time he'll be presenting a lecture on a very interesting and important theme. It's entitled One War, Two Displacements, Language Practices and Attitudes of Ukrainian IDPs and Refugees. That'll be at 2:15 on Tuesday, October 28th, here at Harriman. So please, you're welcome to attend. Today's event is entitled Women Writing War, a Joint Reading and Conversation. And the joint reading and conversation will be taking place with Sasha Dugdale and Oksana Maksymchuk. Sasha Dugdale is a poet and translator. Her sixth book of poetry, The Strongbox, was published by Carsonet in 2024 and won the Anglo-Hellenic League Runciman Award. Deformations, which was published in 2020, was shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot and Derek Walcott prizes. Her long poem, Joy, was awarded a Forward Prize in 2016. Dugdale's translations have won PEN Awards and been shortlisted for the International Booker, the James Tay Black Prize, and the Warwick Prize for Women's Writing, among others. Her translation of Maria Stepanova's In Memory of Memory won the MLA Lewis Roth Award. Her translations of new writing for theater have been widely produced, including stagings by the Royal Court Theatre in London, the Royal Shakespeare Company, and the Public Theatre here in New York. She's a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and former editor of the international magazine Modern Poetry in Translation. Oksana Maksymchuk is a bilingual Ukrainian-American poet, scholar, and literary translator. Her debut English language poetry collection, Still City, was published in 2024 by University of Pittsburgh Press and Carsonet Press. It was longlisted for the 2025 Griffin Poetry Prize and the 2025 PEN Volker Award for Poetry. She's also the author of two award-winning poetry collections, Ksenia and Love, in Ukrainian. Her poems appear in The Guardian, the Irish Times, the Paris Review, the Poetry Review, and many other journals. She co-edited an anthology, Words for War, New Poems from Ukraine, and co-translated several poetry collections, most recently Alex Averbach's Furious Heartless, Harvard University Press 2025, and that's coming this year. She is a recipient of the National Endowment for the Arts Translation Fellowship, the Scaglione Prize for Literary Translation from the Modern Languages Association America, the American Association for Ukrainian Studies Translation Prize, and other honors. Oksana holds a PhD in philosophy from Northwestern University. Born and raised in Lviv, Ukraine, she has also lived in Chicago, Philadelphia, Budapest, Berlin, Warsaw, and Fayetteville, Arkansas. She is currently the fall 2025 Harriman Writer in Residence at Baruch College. So welcome to Sasha and Oksana. So we will have our poets will read from their latest collections, and then we'll have a discussion about these works and about poetry and translation and all these things. So I don't know who wants to go first.
Okay. Yeah. I'm going to stand up to read. Will you let me know if you can hear me or you can't hear me? Yes, I'll put it back. So I'll just say a couple of short words about the Strongbox. I wrote the Strongbox in 2022, and it was initially conceived of as a sort of rewriting of the Iliad, and in particular the story of the abduction of Helen of Troy. And it's one single narrative, but it's very broken up and fragmented, as you'll see from the two small parts that I'll read. And it's also, I'm just trying to think of things I need to say. It's also it mines a lot of texts. So it mines texts that are ancient texts, like the Iliad, of course, but also Heraclitus. And it also mines from texts that I was translating or have translated. And so it's a little bit of a collection of fragments. when I said it earlier this week in Baruch College, and actually it seems it might be quite a helpful thing to say. When I initially started writing the book, I was really interested in the way that, well, conflict is always one of the sort of one of the, I don't know how to say it, one of the things that seems to happen in situations of conflict is that women and children get abducted. That seems to be a continuum, really. And the word for that in English medieval law was the Latin word plagium, and which is very closely related to the word plagiary or the stealing of literary material. And I found that also quite helpful. Initially, I wondered if I could make a title out of that, but it didn't work. So I'll read from the opening of the Strongbox, which is a sort of monologue, as if spoken by Helen of Troy. And then I'll read a second scene, which is very slightly different. And we'll see how we get on. Can you hear me okay? Is it okay? Yeah, great. Actually, if I'm going to be deserted here, I'll come forward a bit. It began with the sun appearing over the plain ring. I don't want to jinx myself. I might start again just in case. It began with the sun appearing over the plain wing, supernatural orange, but no light. A night of bitter memories, sitting bolt upright, phrase book on her lap, travelling east. It began on the least good road, late at night. A silent soldier sent to bring her here, his leather pouch on the passenger seat, his bow slung over his shoulder. The road signs deteriorate, ever smaller, bent and battered, busted, bullet-holed, the roads incline. They stopped at roadside inns twice, and twice she waited in the cold and silence. The music abated, the mountain stars afar. She's told not to open the door, so she huddles, draws her furred hood tighter, the chill of leatherette under her thighs, smell of petrol from jerry cans. She need only light a match, and the whole lot whoomp, just the blackened skeleton of the pickup, men scattering from the inn door. Not too late to run, but where to? Hadn't the fates conspired to weave their bridal shroud, watching her with their one eye hanging from the rear view? Too late, too much has passed. Love came and ripped out her heart, replaced it with a burning coal, folding air tickets into a travel pouch and promises of gifts, swatches of wedding silk, a garnet brooch to bleed out in her sponge bag. And here she is, dabbing wax on her lips, on the cold, slippery back seat in a high-altitude lay-by. Yes, I too have studied the science of parting. There was a press conference. I sat veiled, was asked whether I had given up my rights that night when, with hair loosed, I bent down to examine the wax, or when I opened my door and tiptoed by the wan glow of the nightlight left over from when small children strayed on the landing and their mother scooped them up to soothe them. I slid across the bolts that barred the door, holding to my chest a sports bag, and there outside an unlit car in meagre light heralded the new. Did she say goodbye? Did she wave? Did she genuflect? Text? Did she blow a kiss as she slumped down the stairs? Or think of her brothers, still asleep in their bunk, baby fists resting on superhero sheets? Did she offer prayers of thanks? Did she pass between childhood and marriage like a hostage thrown from one phalanx onto the sand in front of the other. They are pure. At least they talk a great deal about purity in this city where war is the father of all. They slip off shoes at the door, and always after wrestling or shooting, slaves run strigils over their naked backs, and before they are dressed in laundered gowns, they are rubbed with oils and unguents, forbidden to use deodorants or products, or pain relief, or even gas at the dentist, strapping weapons on themselves, brandishing pikes, standing free to a chariot. They are like the heroes in children's tales, sleeping on dry bracken after a swim. You know how it says, no one steps in the same river twice, always scattering the grass. She has a dream in the wretched cellar, so very far from home, although when she wakes, nothing is real, only slowly becomes real as she wakes, and the dream lapping recedes. But in the dream, she knew she'd had this dream before. Within the dream announced itself as a repeating dream. Within her dream, there is a past contained in recognition, that aching sense that moves just ahead of her, like water, that she has been here before, that she's been here eternally before. The dream was of a freezing desert. Hard to capture a dream because it moves just ahead. It seems there, but it isn't, always partly clothed. But the sky was speckled with stars, and this journey through the vast, cold nothing led to something beyond her wildest. But she was perhaps confused. Was this not space? Did there exist such a wild place on the globe? Every wild place is simply the edge of our wildest. But to another, it is the center. She would not be surprised to see a group of women eating under a frozen tree on a plain, arboreous chandelier, raining its glass on them, where they pass food about, lipstick on their mouths in the wilderness, skirts and scarves, and the tree scattering its crystal shock. It could just be a spasm of memory, or it could be a picnic under a frozen plum tree in outer space. It is true, I said. That morning in the basement, we thought we had nothing left, but day after day we were losing, one after another, brought home, defiled, dust-stained. All their lives moisture smeared across the punishing grit, hemorrhaging loss. It seemed we could lose no more, every new handful scooped from a vast heap of loss. And yet, when we sang the gods' praises. We sang of riches we had once enjoyed. Okay. Okay, good to see you all back so promptly. Thank you. Thank you. I really like to start on time. So can we make a little ring with our chairs, perhaps? That's great. Okay. We're going to do a little exercise now. We've all had a read through, and I think we're there with the text. So what I'd like to do this, have you all heard of actioning? It's I thought so. It's good. It's standard stuff, but it can yield some insights, I find, especially at the beginning of the rehearsal period, and it can be invaluable with a tricky text or one that doesn't initially appear to have a narrative. So I'd like to get us into groups of two. Yeah, okay, two, and you can be a threesome over there, so to speak. Now, I'd like you each to take a short fragment and just action it line by line. I know this can be unfamiliar, so let's just do a group one quickly together so we can all get the hang of it. For example, in the speech, "It is true," I said. Yeah, have you got that one? It's page 14 on your scripts. Right, okay, so here we go. "It's true," I said, "that morning in the basement we thought we had nothing left, but day after day we were losing one after another, brought home, defiled, dusty." What do we think are the actions that underpin that text? I mean, if you want to think of it more loosely as a gestus in the Brechtian sense, that can be useful. And I think it may help if we stick to verbs as well. Which verbs are the machines behind the silly piece? What is going on? What's the author trying to make happen here? Yes, that's right. We've got anguish. Okay, anguish is really more of an abstract state, right? Can we transform it into a verb, a doing word, a word of action? In fact, people, can we steer clear of abstraction here? Let's stick to verbs. I want the concrete. The truth is concrete, as Bert Brecht says. Hopelessness? No, hopelessness won't do either. I want active agency. Important to remember active agency in battle at all times. Otherwise, where's the conflict, the dynamic? If we can't identify it, what do we present as we speak the lines? If you like, where's the fight if you can't lift the sword? There are times when stasis doesn't cut the mustard. After all, I like to see the blossoming tree, but only my disgust at the speeches of the warmonger brings me to the rehearsal room. Thank you.
Very much, Sasha. So,
I think it would be nice maybe to take a break from poetry, have a little discussion, then we can return to the reading.
Yes, yeah, I think that's right, because I think that
We need to decompress after all of the compression we've been doing in the past 15 minutes.
yes, yeah,
before we compress again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Before we.
that's right. There's a completely yes, it's a good idea.
Any questions from the public? Anything we've read here? So you mentioned obviously two different, very different sections of the book. It was fascinating to hear this. I've heard this for the first time. Today's event was entitled come on, Women Writing War, right? And you mentioned introducing your reading today about this idea of women and children being abducted during war. And we've had, over the years, especially over the last 3 years, we've had several people presenting their poetry. A lot of poets from Ukraine presenting, trying to deal with war in literary texts in various forms. We've had poetry, we've had essays. We've even had, I think it was last year, we had Yude Erucha doing this really short prose fragments called My Women. What perspective does, because we've also had male writers as well, right? But we're talking about women. What perspectives do women writers have that they can offer us that say a male writer doesn't when writing about war? Or is it how different do women write about war than men? In this case, we're focusing on, or is it the same? Is there any different perspective?
I'm not sure if there is. I'm not sure if there's any sort of inherent difference, but there's certainly differences of experience often, and that. So as a translator, I translate Natalia Ворожбит's plays, and so it's perhaps easiest to talk about that. The play Bad Road, for example, deals quite extensively with particularly women's experiences. So women as medics in the war zones, women and their relationships, their family relationships, or their kind of sexual relationships with people who are involved in war on all sides. And I think that might be perhaps quite a woman's perspective, in the sense that she's probably tapping into, well, I know she's tapping into accounts of people that she knows. And I suppose there is a sort of energy in the fact that these are perspectives that haven't traditionally been heard. Traditionally, it hasn't been a female domain, but those experiences are just as important and revealing.
Yeah, one way to flip the question is to ask, what is it that men can tell us about war that women cannot? Right? That kind of question brings out the asymmetry. And I think in part it's because these women's perspectives and women writing has been kind of coming into its own just over the past 200 years, really. Traditionally, all of the classical texts about war and all of the conceptions of war have been formulated by these illustrious men. And it's also not really coincidental that I think the emergence of more women's voices coincides with the emergence of war writing as basically anti-war writing. There used to be a lot of writing that just celebrated war, and it's really a 20th century phenomenon that when you hear like it's a war novel, you assume the author will be critical of the war, or if it's a war poem, that it's going to be somehow distancing itself from the glory and the triumph and the kind of heroics that's usually associated with war. And there have been traditionally authors who have been very, very sensitive to female experience of war. Like I'm thinking of Euripides as Trojan Women. It was very clear that he could lay out exactly what the fate of women is in a city that has been besieged and invaded, how they're divided as the spoils of war, how their children are killed, and their husbands are killed, and they become these objects. But at the same time, we don't really have any writing by women about these circumstances. And yes, I think it's the change in optics and the change in topics, and I think the change in tone as well, right? It's very different for women to be trapped in a war, in part because so many of these experiences of being a civilian in the war actually involve reduced agency or reduced sense of agency, and men are subjected to it too. But there is also the perspective of a warrior, of somebody who is in the front line, all of these other perspectives that seem to overshadow or eclipse this more traditional, conventional perspective of being a civilian at a distance from war and witnessing it from afar. So that's another way in which I think it's illuminating to look at women's writing. At the anthology Words for War, for instance, involved out of, I think, 16 poets, 8 were women, and part of the reason we were able to include these voices was because we decided that witnessing war can be extremely mediated. You can witness war on screens, you can witness war on TV, you can get news from war, from in various forms in the social media, in reports, but also we have all of this massive documentation like drone footage and body camera footage, and you don't have to be a soldier to have experiences of this. A lot of women are also watching this type of footage that's making war very real to them. So there is a kind of spectrum of reasons why women are becoming part of the canon of war writing.
And of course, there are women that are actually on the front lines and serving as well, providing a perspective that's not civilian, which is also interesting, I think.
Right.
You mentioned the play by Elizabeth that you translated, which was a very important play. And Oksana, you mentioned the anthology Word for War, and talking about different optics. Those were both written a long time ago, right? Those poems that are featured in your anthology and the play that you translated before the full-scale invasion in Ukraine. Are you engaging in texts that have been written as translators, engaging in texts that have been written since full-scale invasion? And have you noticed as people have translated and worked with these wartime texts, any change in optics, in anything that's been different in the last 5 years, as in the last 3 years, as opposed to the invasion in eastern Ukraine.
Well, I've just translated Natalia's more recent play, Three Friends, which is a monologue by a man who's hiding out to kind of escape conscription. And he's in dialogue with his two friends online. One has gone to Europe and the other one is on the front line. And it's his monologue, his internal monologue, and he talks about each of them. And it's a very, very different tone thing. It's a much more, but there's a sort of weariness, I think, and perhaps a very, very different level of reality, and cynicism about self-motivation, I think, which is really interesting to read, to translate. And is an experience that is so internal. I feel as if it's not something that's covered so much in the media.
Because when Natalka wrote the script for the cyborgs, all of those dialogues tended to focus, I think, again on the heroics and the people who were reluctant or ambiguously, I don't know, positioned, were certainly depicted with a little bit less sympathy than the heroes. And I think there is a little bit of a shift maybe, and also, you know, like there is more of a sympathy for this kind of the person who is villainously trying to avoid conscription and do their part.
Yes, and I suppose there's arguments about audience there, is because if you're producing a film in a time of war with a lot of money production, then the heroics are probably going to be more production worthy elements.
And it's a more private kind of. And there is also a question of Western versus Ukrainian audience. A lot of things that strike a chord with the Western audience, the Ukrainian audience is not quite receptive to in this current moment, because Ukrainians are facing an existential crisis. So it's kind of like in Britain, anyone who is sitting it out is considered to be engaging in this, you know, terrible moral behavior. But long after the war, people can be, you know, sympathetic with different reasons about why you actually are reluctant to join the fight.
That's really interesting, because that's actually bears on something that I was going to ask Oksana if we could talk about, which is creativity, which is also like a sort of sitting out, if you see what I mean, and how you produce art in a time of conflict without feeling morally compromised by the fact that you're being creative instead of, I don't know, knitting camouflage netting or something.
And I wonder whether that may be the different ways of grappling with that dilemma is also part of the reason why in Ukraine we are having a kind of renaissance of women's writing. That women feel less guilty about writing than men do, because men know that there is an opportunity cost. They could always be doing something else. There is a lot of men's writing, but it's really, you know, it used to be that, I don't know, like 90% of people who go to all of these international events on behalf of Ukraine, representing Ukraine, would be these big male writers. And now it's really shifted. And in part is because women are producing a lot of work.
Do you think it was something you mentioned before, as Ukrainian writers and Ukrainian works are at least a little bit getting translated more and having more connection with the world outside Ukraine, which you're a part of. Do you think now that Ukrainian writers are writing somewhat for a Western audience, or are they still just writing? Because you mentioned how it's different to write for a Ukrainian audience and for a Western audience. Somebody that's been published in the West several times now. Are they keeping that in mind? focusing on a Ukrainian topic, but writing for an audience outside Ukraine. Do you think that's something that develops as a literature is being
I think
introduced?
so. I
Yeah.
think there is definitely a kind of, sense of shouldering the burden of representing Ukraine to the world that many people feel. And so they're writing with the hope of being translated, which already kind of changes the way that they write. In poetry, for instance, one way in which it expresses itself is that a lot of people write in free verse and try to focus on creating the kind of poetry that would work well as a translated text rather than focusing on the techniques and the embellishments that would be untranslatable and that would stay within the Ukrainian language. So there is definitely a kind of, like an outward movement of trying to show the world what this is like. And again, it has to do with this existential sense that we need visibility, we need attention, we need allies in order to protect our sovereignty. Ukraine cannot do this war on its own. It needs to rely on supplies of all sorts of informational and technological aid from the allies, and that also means that culture becomes conceived as a kind of diplomacy and international front, an expansion of the political influence.
That seems to me to be quite unprecedented
Mhm.
because I've seen that happening as well, and I can't think of another example of that where, even poetry has become a sort of cultural expression of I mean it just seems very, very unique to me, this Ukrainian Renaissance, the arts, which is actually also being used to attract support, and it's an interesting phenomenon. Yeah.
Certainly a major characteristic of what's being written today,
Yeah.
definitely. Any questions? Yes, please. Speak up a little bit, please.
I have two questions for the students. I remember, Oksana, that in your first book presentation of the city on Zoom, organized the publisher, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm reciting from memory, what the idea, so please feel free to correct me if that's off. I remember you saying that when you were forming your identity as a writer, when you were finding a place within Ukrainian canon, what was happening at the cusp of the century and how poetry was being written, you had a sensation as if the whole agency and subjectivity of a writer in gender terms was very murky. It was very hard to insert yourself as a female subject within the poetry, because to some degree that would diminish your value in the literary community, because poetry tended to be more abstract and as if not gendered, but implicitly demanding that it shouldn't be too much female, not to be female poetry. And I was wondering if you see over the years, especially now that we change within the war poetry and the impact of war on this question to what's happening to the female agency and female subjectivity in Ukrainian contemporary poetry. Because there are some bigger cultural processes that are happening, not only in Ukrainian literature, but I was just wondering how war impacts that. And thank you so much also to Sasha. It's a pleasure to see you again. We hosted amazing. It was an amazing workshop last year of translation. Even hearing you reading some of the same poems again. I just feel this relaxation poem that you also read then, if I'm not mistaken. The whole interactivity of it. It plays differently each time in every room. Even last time we were sitting in a more open space and the sound traveled beautiful things, noticing how fascinating it is. And I want to ask about I would say how do you see the value in those trans temporal and trans cultural transitions thinking about war and war's impact, if there are any like new expansions of that, because in the workshop we work in particular like Max, in particular author of Marina Skayeva, and there also have some like war topics, clearly very different and like very different dimensions of being alienated very much from the reader and like, you know, deeply lonely, and like this another dimension of war poetry that seems to be deeply interconnected also because of the change of technology and the contemporary moment. I'm just thinking like if you're looking at other like transnational contexts to think about wars and what of the recent, I don't know, like ideas or like thoughts you things you encountered in different cultures.
Thank you, Yulia, for the lovely questions. And I'm so glad that you were there at the Zoom. So yes, I think I did mention this in the context of a shift between thinking of art as something that has to be eternal and timeless and striving towards this transcendence of every particularity. So there is a kind of universalizing impulse there, right? The overcoming of everything that's individual and particular and trying to express everything all at once. And then to actually embracing this embeddedness and historicity and the fact that we cannot overcome our circumstances in this way, and we cannot overcome our bodies in this way. It's going to obscure something if we pretend like we do or we have. So it's very much, I think, grounded in a very specific perspective, what I do now. And there is like an embracing of this very individual, very particular perspective, but I think in a way that also actually still reaches and illuminates the universals. I no longer try to erase all of this kind of mucky individualism from the work.
Yes, that's really interesting. Sorry, just to carry on that thought but we talked about women's writing earlier in terms of position and where women are, but we didn't really touch on the women's bodies side of it, and the fact that, you know, women writing still having sort of reproductive issues or caring burdens, or, you know, all these other things that characterize a woman's life. So I was thinking that actually that was something else that had never been really drawn into conflict literature in the past. And in terms of the transnational, thank you so much. I can't remember, because I can't remember what happened yesterday, what poem it was by Tsvetaeva that we looked at. Can you remind me? Oh, don't worry if you can't find it, it's fine. But I think it was a poem that really spoke to the moment. But then I'm wondering whether the question of transnational and isn't actually something that. Yes, that's right. Yeah. And you know, because that was a sort of immigration poem, wasn't it? I think, yeah. And but I'm wondering if the idea about transnational doesn't characterize really, in some ways, the sort of literature that has the biggest reach, I suppose. That I know you said earlier that some of the poems that you read have been interpreted or used in other conflicts as and people have even thought they might be about those conflicts, and that is, to me, the sign of a very successful poem about the human experience of conflict.
Shall we maybe go back to reading?
Yeah.
I usually mumble into the page, but I'm going to try to measure up to Sasha. And I'm sorry a couple of you have heard all of the poems before. I think, yeah, Julia and Lakshmi and Sasha. So I composed this collection as a kind of chronicle. I started it about half a year before the full-scale invasion, and I was thinking that I'm going to develop into it into something that's like a journal about non-events, something that doesn't actually happen, because I didn't think the invasion was going to happen. But then it happened, and so I kept writing, and it transformed into into something darker. And the poems kind of reflect that they're more or less chronologically organized, but there are some outliers. Intimate relationship. I bought a hat of falling fur to wear in the war. In my hat I sit in my cellar waiting. The enemy's late. I read his messages on my phone, popping open jars of strawberry jam lining the cellar walls. Like a lover, my enemy sends me flowers, emojis, words of condolence, supplications, doctored screenshots, explicit photos. Reversals. A shirt turned inside out retains the shape of a torso, matching it in form. A home turned inside out, not a skeleton, but a pile of rubble brought by gravity to a resting point. A body turned inside out is a spectacle, resembling a bag spilling its private content. A mountain turned inside out is still a mountain. Several circles. What I see is an eye, while you're seeing a female breast, purple nipple on top like a cherry. Stubbornly phenomenal circles join, overlap, sending each mind on its own lonely journey. So Kandinsky and Glass sat in each other's lap for a little while in a house they shared in the south. As outside the frame yet another shape shed its flesh, exposing the blackened spine of a rising inverted star. Here, beloved, taste my eyeball, rinsed in a special cocktail only I can craft in my mortal body. Still life of a person with a pug. She was walking her pug down the street in a town where she spent her childhood and teenage years, still in her winter coat, even though it was getting warmer and the buds on the poplars grew engorged. Something bit her in the back, and she fell and lay there on the sidewalk. The next day, a neighbor brought out a sheet with tiny roses for that which was once her body, a matching pillowcase for the pugs. A passerby took a photograph and posted it on Telegram, causing an avalanche of angry emojis. Water under a bridge. No more bridge now, but the river flows as it did before, like a single tear rolls down the face of the landscape, tears through the terrain laid out for it by another tear and another before it. Doesn't grieve when the towns clustered along its banks fly in ruins. Doesn't weep cradling the corpses, toying with the remains. Indiscriminate, like a poem's flow, reflecting everything, changing nothing. Drone footage. When a shell strikes a person, there is a scattering resembling a flock of birds taking off, hands flying in the air, signaling, feet levitating in mid-kick. Their avian shapes casting shadows, light and carefree from on high. Rocket in the room. What the rocket has in common with the room School of Children is its current location. Somebody thought the rocket belonged in the room with children, and now it's here. In time, someone else will come and collect the pieces of the rocket and of the children, weeping and shouting insults at the sky. But for now, this rocket and these children are an unsorted matter, a puzzle awaiting a solution. Advice to a young poem. Stay little poem, fun and sharp like a charm, mysterious, a maker of no sense. Fewer things can go wrong with fewer lines. Fewer promises break in fewer words. Little ones trickle out of the cage through bars one can barely see, seep through the capillaries in a windowless and evasive mind that's devised ways to protect itself against spells and magic. Helpless yet busily resilient, they form like clouds, woven of gauze and mucus, dealing in recovery of broken hope, delivery of the forgotten, inessential yet here. Little ones of no weight are enough to transform as one peers into the sky to the sound of an air raid siren, falls asleep in a bathtub, dances inside a cellar. Blank pages. And this one with an epigraph from Hegel. History is not the soil in which happiness grows. The periods of happiness in it are the blank pages of history. In the story of a life, too, happiness is a kind of silence, a lacuna of meaning, a sweet ellipsis. No disruptions, dangerous forks in the road, hard rocks to hurl, thrills that shake to the core. In the blessed lull of unearned, free-falling calm, there are stories to tell, words to form. Weaving verses out of faint gusts of wind, susurrating branches, filling the pages with clouds and trees. Songbirds calling out of the thicket, shadows settled on a beloved face. Things so delicate and so thin, they barely appear on a clear film of a life well lived. Each day a rhyme the previous day, synchronized and ordered. Immortal. Kingdom of Friends. In the brief intermission between world wars, we somehow managed to weave a language out of the things we felt mattered for our future as an impermanent species. Barely even words, but collections of signals from distant planes of existence, patterns expressive of a communion between roots and surfaces, sprawling networks of fungi, projectiles of spores, shooting out exhort self-navigating missiles, propagating a form of rebirth that would touch us all, impartially, indiscriminately. Approximations. Waking up in a borrowed room, in a body borrowed for a time, and a time borrowed and hardly used. I remember how light my head becomes when the boys overtaking us in the alley tickle me with guns, running them down my spine and my head. How I levitate, the force of a scream suppressed, lifting me up and up. And the way it gets dark when strange men pound on my door at night, shouting, "Open up, or we'll break it in." Right before the war, I'd wake up in bed, dreaming of another bed, body in it exposed, bone by bone, like a radiograph, through a brilliance, an explosion tearing at the membranes that ensconce the sleeper. Close yet not an exact match, like a rhyme in a poem, you compose post haste, lines blurred by terror. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oksana. As we mentioned, as I was introducing you, you're bilingual, Ukrainian American poet. And you're an established poet in Ukrainian. You've published in Ukrainian, but this is your debut publication book in the English language. So kind of going back to one of the poems you read today, this Advice to a Young Poem. Would this be an established poet, an Ukrainian, advising a young poet, young English language poet, all in one person, or who are you addressing? As a way of asking, how different is it for you to write now in this language than in Ukrainian? What do you find yourself doing differently than you've been doing when you wrote poetry in English? And then follow up, I guess. You've been translating so much poetry into English from Ukrainian. How big a part of your work as a translator has informed the way you write in English?
Right. So it's the poem is titled "Advice to a Young Poem," and it's advice to stay little. While in fact the poem is quite long. It's one of the longer poems in the book. So it's meant to be this kind of a little bit ironic insofar as all advice to poems is going to be futile. It's going to be what it wants to be, and it's not going to follow any kind of authorial intention. In this case, it's like the author, I guess the poet, in the poet's voice, advising the work how to grow. And the work is rebelling against this advice by growing into something quite different. And bringing the poet with it, there is a kind of entrapment and entanglement, I feel. So in that sense, I think, I don't know, everybody's voice is so idiosyncratic. I'm not sure that you can advise, you can issue universal advice, basically, but also I'm not sure you can actually advise people. Even in specific circumstances, you have to kind of know that it's extremely subjective, that you're necessarily going to be conditioned and determined by your expectations, your schooling, your orientation to the tradition, all of these things. And so you may not be able to actually even discern what's going on in the work of another and in your own work. Often you just trust the work that emerges without liking it or having intended to make it that way or having, given your approval to its emergence. Now, with the translation, I feel that many of us are doing very related things. So I definitely see of this collection as a contribution to this larger project that all of us are part of, and a larger chorus of voices and a larger community of poets. And I feel like maybe I have a little bit of an advantage because I've actually gone very carefully through so much of the writing that is being produced that I kind of can calibrate my voice so it doesn't do exactly the same types of things, and that it adds something to the chorus. And it's not just, I think what happens when you translate is that it makes you a really slow, attentive reader. It slows you down significantly when you're looking at somebody else's text. So it's not even so much that I've been translating, it's just I've been reading this stuff slowly and carefully, and that has shaped me into a different kind of writer as well.
Mhm.
But
Thank you.
But it might be worth asking, in addition to that, you say that you use the fact that you read a body of work about the war, so you could place your work in an uncovered area, but you're writing in a different language as well. So does that not change the texture? I suppose, yeah, the texture, I suppose.
Right, it changes the texture. If I'm just looking at it as the chorus of Ukrainian voices, but I'm kind of, I always try to look broader too. So definitely part of the Ukrainian chorus, but also part of the kind of broader chorus as well.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, as a translator, one of the things that made you do is read, read the things you're translating more carefully and slower. But and going kind of what Sasha said, like you're writing in English here, so you're basically writing to certainly an audience that you've been contributing to as a translator, right?
Yeah.
So I think of it, if you're placing your poetry within this chorus, then you know it's in English has
Right.
been written. So I think that directs how somewhat how you write the poetry in English.
Right. And also the fact that I've lived in the States since I was 15. English has been, I've studied English since I was 7. English has been like very important for me. And I have this American identity in addition to having Ukrainian identity, I'm sure, as you have both a Canadian and American identity.
I'm
now
not
as
Canadian,
well.
but I would like to.
Well, so I think part of what happens is that a lot of what I did in the collection was not just using my Ukrainian identity as a lens for producing these poems, but toggling between the two. And that kind of, I think about what it means to be a beneficiary of injustice and of war that's waged on another soil and at another country's expense differently, because I'm also American. And so I feel, we are all implicated in the wars that have been waged in our name. And so for me, it's a little bit like my conception of what it means to be the enemy in this situation is a bit different, precisely because I also feel like all of us are enemies to somebody. All of us are beneficiaries of the unjust wars that our country has waged for us. So there is maybe less of an attempt to kind of identify the source of evil. But I think for a lot of Ukrainians, it's very urgent. They need to feel that they're unjustly subjected to the violence, but they are not themselves the source of the violence. Well, I think for us in the States, it's very difficult not to think of ourselves as also the source of the violence.
Thank you.
This reminds me of something that the Korean poet Kim Hae-sun said, and she said that when you sort of protest from outside, it's not it's kind of not realistic because we're all inside. So the protest must be from inside. And I always thought that was a really good kind of rule for writing somehow, that it would work better. It would have more moral integrity from coming from within.
Any questions? Yes, please.
So Oksana, you have this, very, I would say, memorable, evocative, let's say, poems that we all have illustrations on our memory too, in forms of media files. For example, the rocket in the room, the body exploding, and drone strike emojis that are accompanying all these things. We saw them, but these are the wordless matter almost. You can't really like even describe that, and you were like feeling it so perfectly into the words. I'm wondering, how do you take this dead matter and this violence to which we are all exposed and kind of transform them into words? How does that begin for you?
A great question, Vasilina, fellow poet. How do we begin with poems? I don't know. I mean, The Rocket in the Room was definitely written before there were any rockets in the room in the Ukrainian context. It preceded, but it's because it's such a obvious thing about, what is destined to happen and what does happen in all such contexts. So in many ways, it was, not really retrospective descriptions of the images that I've received through some other, through the media. Sometimes it is, but even with I think, sometimes I read the pug poem and people are like, I know like exactly the woman in the pug. I've never seen the woman in the pug. I don't know where that came from. I may have read some kind of sentence that suggested that scene, but I don't actually have the images kind of emerge for me with the poems. They're constituted by the words, not the other way around. So often it begins with a phrase or a line or a situation, and the situation is kind of blurry to me. So really to understand the contours of the situation, I have to write the poem to lay out the parts of what it is that I'm sensing. And it's often like sensing that there is a puzzle somewhere, but then you're working to not solve the puzzle, but describe the parameters of the puzzle.
Yeah, it's just so evocative because these
Mhm.
emojis, for example, we saw the angry emojis,
Mhm.
but we also saw laughing emojis, like
Mm,
60,000 laughing emojis on the pictures of the memorial of the young girl who died, right? It's like,
And that's fascinating, right? Like, how would the poem change if I said laughing emojis? Obviously, like the enemy is a bastard and a beast and a monster, which it is.
Yeah.
But
I'm really fascinated that the images came in the constitution and the poem, because I was just thinking about there's the British poet Christopher Logue who did the war music, his interpretation of the Iliad, and he used to collate images from the newspaper. He had masses of scrapbooks, and he used that old-fashioned computer paper and put flowcharts of scraps and things, and then those scraps entered his reworking of the Homer. Whereas for you, it's almost like the opposite. You are in a situation where these images are floating around the whole time, but the images in your poems are drawn from something much more abstract and perhaps like prophetic, which is
archaic.
Yes, or archaic, which is really, it's just a fascinating kind of counterbalance to that.
But I do really like that process of collaging, I guess. It's not how I work, but some of the poets do work this way, and that's interesting too. And I think in this case, when you're actually trying to create a new version of a classic, that gives you the detail in which you can bring the older version alive in the current moment. So I can see how that's actually like a really like reliable method.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I have like an explicit method like that.
But you have a sort of philosophical underpinning, conscious or not, which I know we've talked about, and I think is really interesting. The idea of a sort of almost like a philosophical hypothesis.
Yeah. And again, it's not very conscious, I think, in most cases. Unless it's, like sometimes I tell this story because I was also writing a paper on Hegel and Plato when I started the collection. And so I think there is a contamination with definitely with both, but certainly because Hegel is less familiar to me. I'm a Plato scholar and my friend is a Hegel scholar. I was trying to engage more with what I didn't know. And so I think Hegel left more of a visible mark precisely because it's not as well integrated.
That's fascinating.
Any other questions? Yes.
I have a question. Thank you for the talk. I wanted to ask more follow-up to your previous conversation. And it was about the fact that Ukrainians writing Ukrainian in a Western style. Is there kind of a similar movement where, let's say, Ukrainians who speak English, or just like maybe just people who speak English but fascinated by Ukrainian poetry, writes in Ukrainian style but in English? And have you ever done it yourself?
We've seen some of that, right? Christina, who opened the event at Cornell, she wrote an English language poem that was very Ukrainian in form. It was, stanzas and meter and rhymes. So I think people do, this is the way they also kind of, I think, make their claim on English, especially people who came as recent refugees and they have a lot to express. And they're translating their kind of knowledge of Ukrainian verse construction into the English language context. But I think maybe this kind of desire to be translated into Western languages also has to do with the turning away from Russian, actually. That, people are, a lot of people have objected to being translated into Russian or to having unauthorized translations into Russian made of their work. So it may be also this kind of orientation, the Europa чи просвіта, the kind of like, we're going to choose one and we're going to try to, there is no point addressing Russians at this point. We're going to speak to these other people. And so trying to adopt them, because a lot of the English language poetry is free verse, and they're trying to write in a more familiar idiom. It's not just about being translated, but also about claiming their belonging to a particular world tradition.
Can I quickly follow up?
Yes.
How do you think it impacts like Ukrainian heritage and Ukrainian culture in general? Does it not get more globalized in a sense, less unique? That's basically the question.
Well, it's interesting because we've had a very strong tradition of free verse, for instance. But I wonder if, there is some kind of association of this like very tightly rhythmic and rhyme poetry also with the connectedness with the Russian Empire and the Soviet Empire. There is a kind of, family resemblance between these types of poetries, because Russians also tend to have similar poetic forms. So maybe this turning away, it's not like we were always, autonomous and unaffected by anything. We had our own tradition. We were always in conversation with somebody. And it just the kind of the subject of conversation has changed, and our orientation, who we want to talk to, is maybe shifting as well.
Your question made me think of, just before we met today, I got an email. Somebody sent me a link there that you have to watch this, and I haven't watched it yet, but apparently, maybe you've heard, there's the 14-year-old boy from Lviv who made a short animated film called Human Stus, and he did it in English.
Interesting.
And people were like, "Oh, can he translate this into Ukrainian?" So he decided. Obviously, this was sent out, and he decided to do it in English, which is interesting.
That is very interesting.
yeah.
Which school was he? Was it
I don't know. I didn't even get to watch it yet. It's like a 5-minute film, but apparently it's the story of Stus made with Lego figures in English by a 14-year-old. Yeah, in wartime Ukraine. So fascinating.
Very cool.
Any questions for our guests? I will have a question actually for Sasha, actually for both of you, but correct me if I'm wrong, but when you translated Natalka Verzbit's Bad Rose, it was done particularly for a play so that it could be staged before it was published as a book.
Yes.
Right? Which is, when we translate plays, we always hope that they get staged, or even when the author writes a play, you would hope sometimes, I guess, that it gets staged. It'd be nice. And then as translators, even more so. I'm wondering if that, and what is the presence of Ukrainian drama? If you've worked on subsequent translations, are plays getting staged, or is there more of a? Have you noticed like other things that you have translated or that you've seen translated? Are they actually entering theaters and being staged in Ukrainian drama, whether it's contemporary or? Yeah, and there's a lot of new translations now coming, Vasil Green and stuff. Have you noticed that where you work, or Oksana, is Ukrainian drama being staged? I guess is the long, short version of my question.
Well, we talked about this briefly because it's very expensive to produce a play, and it's hundreds of thousands of dollars. So the financial investment is huge, and international translations from any language make up a tiny percentage of the work that's produced overall. So the number of Ukrainian plays is going to be necessarily pretty minute. And on the whole, I'd say that apart from one or two names that I think Natalia is probably the forerunner, it's limited to small, very independent theatres or theatres with a Ukrainian interest, like the London Ukrainian Theatre. And I think there are actually Ukrainian language theatres or theatres with a Ukrainian particular interest in different cities. So it's pretty small. But I mean, I don't think that's particularly to do with Ukraine. It's just a factor. I mean, in the UK, there are two new writing theatres, the Traverse and the Royal Court, and the other theatres hardly stage any new plays by British playwrights, let alone translations. It's not a terribly, in a way, progressive medium because of the money, the various financial implications. And so taking a risk on a new playwright of any sort is kind of exceptional. It's an exceptional theatre.
That's why I asked about Bad Rose. I was kind of an outlier. I was fascinated.
So it's a very, very significant breakthrough. Yeah.
Wonderful.
That's the way to look at it. Yeah.
Wonderful. So,
We've just translated a play by Sasha Verbuch, Talks with the Besieged. And it's a kind of docu-play. It's based on Telegram chats between people who were just in the process of falling under occupation in 22-23.
okay.
And it's being staged, I think, on Wednesday as part of the Razom initiative. It's going to just be produced at once. Like a Greek tragedy, they never, every masterpiece was only produced once. And then it's done.
So expensive.
New stuff next year. But then when I asked Sasha, would it make sense to publish this as a play or rather as a poem? Because it could be either. And Sasha was like, definitely as a poem. So there is a kind of also, when you're choosing genres, some work is hybrid, so it can go either this way or that way, and for the purposes of theater production it can be performed, but it can also be published as a kind of reader friendlier genre, and still like completely non-commercial, but that was interesting to me because yes, people are much less likely to, and I think Natalka is saying this too, that it's very hard to sell books.
Yes, playbooks.
Because people are reluctant to read plays.
Yeah. But having said that, there is a sort of element of depth as well. If a play by Natalka is produced by the Royal Court, then it's almost certainly going to be picked up by other big theatres because one theatre's taken a risk and then the others are happy to follow. So there's a sort of repeating effect, which is not necessarily recognised.
And
a ripple.
Yes.
And I'm glad that it was eventually published because I've been giving it to my students to read since it appeared as a copy. So I'm very happy that that dynamic kind of kicked in and we had the result. Thank you. Any more questions for our guests while they're here now? Well, thank you so much for beautiful readings, for your wonderful new publications, and for the discussion. I think this was very good. Thank you all for coming. Yes, thanks for visiting us at Harriman. favorite today in the newspaper also that there's a director who's writing a screenplay and a novel is being written on a very similar thing at the same time. And it's going to be these two totally different genres,
Yeah.
but they're somehow going to be related. Yeah, it's the director who directed The Sixth Sense. That was a big film in the 90s. Yeah, and so he's writing the screenplay.